AdLib is the smartest way to activate programmatic. Built for expert traders, yet easy enough for any marketer. Launch across all top DSPs without contracts, overhead, or busy work. Schedule a free trial today and start maximizing ROAS with AdLib. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com. Thank you to MediaOcean for sponsoring Open Market. It started with some friendly banter on X, and now we're running a series of ads recapping the 13 announcements they made in June. Last week was the IAB's new Invoice API spec developed with Prisma. This week it's a partnership between Innovid and LinkedIn for CTV. Now you can use LinkedIn's audience data with Innovid's creative tools to reach B2B professionals on the big screen. Like venture capital and martial arts, some things are just better together. Tune in next week for another news highlight and visit MediaOcean.com/pod to learn more. Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa. I'm joined by Eric Franchi and fellow Aperiam partner, Corey Ferengul. What's up, Corey?
Hello.
Corey, how you doing, bud?
Just trying to, get through another week,
Given that this is sort of like a professional manager type podcast episode, Corey, are there any things you would like to litigate with Eric about the history of your collaboration together at Undertone?
Oh, man, I don't even know where to start with that one. I mean, geez.
Let the roasting session.
Joe just sprung it on Eric. Eric didn't know it was coming.
So for those who don't know Corey Ferengul, let me do the intro, and then we'll get into the conversation. And by the way, this episode today is all about boards for startups and scaling companies, and there's no one better to talk about this. I've been working with Corey now for over 10 years. We originally hired Corey as the COO of Undertone, and I want to say 2013.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, after he had an incredible career. We hired him out of a company called Rovi, which is now TiVo. Corey, and I'm not understating this, really transformed our company. He helped bring in processes and the ability to scale across everything that we did, but with a particular focus on product, technology, and marketing, and took us to the point where we were a good acquirer, we were a good product company, and ultimately Corey was promoted to CEO after a year or so, and he helped drive the ball into the end zone with a successful acquisition by Aperiam. So I think the absolute world of Corey Ferengul. I give him a lot of credit, but I'm glad to be able to do so publicly here again on Open Market, and I'm so excited that he's now back with us at Aperiam and helping to scale what we do for our portfolio companies. And, specific to this episode, Corey went on to be CEO of Magnetic, sold it to Deloitte, a company called Yellow in the HR tech space. And along the way, he has been a board member and investor in a bunch of companies and a bunch of funds. So, again, brings an incredible skill set that is, quite underappreciated across ad tech. But, hopefully after hearing this, everybody will appreciate Corey that much more.
Thanks, Eric. That's very polite of you. I'll also add that back in the Rovi days, we were a public company and we went through a massive transition. So I was in the boardroom sometimes multiple times a quarter as we were selling off half the business and doing, what do we do, over 20 acquisitions and divestitures in a 3-year period, right? So I've got board exposure in the seat of CEO in, private. I've got employee in public. I've sat on public boards. I've sat on private boards. So you guys asked me to talk about boards. I was like, yeah, I've got a few insights here.
Awesome.
Nice.
Joe, why don't you kick us off?
Well, yeah, this is a company about building companies in the advertising industry, and so it's really by and for founders. So, Corey, let's look at it from that perspective. So let's start from the beginning. You're a founder and you're starting a company. Do you need a board right away? When and in what cases do you assemble a board?
And I feel like I get that question a lot from startups. As Eric points out, I've been doing angel investing as well as fund investing. So I talk with a lot of early stage CEOs. And, my advice is you don't necessarily need a board right away. As a matter of fact, you don't want a board until you need a board. And you typically need a board when you take on investors. Big investors, angels, not necessarily. As a matter of fact, I get very frustrated when I see an angel investor say, I'm going to write a $100,000 check, but I want a board seat and I want this. And I'm like, this person isn't serious. They're out for equity. This isn't going to be helpful. When you're doing truly a true round of funding, millions of dollars involved, or you see some real value in that person, even if they're only putting in a small check, you want them to be part of the business. It's not to say every board member has to be an investor, but that's typically where it comes from in the early days. So early founder, just starting the company, fight having a board. Don't have a board for as long as you can. What's the board useful for you in that point in your evolution, right? They're useful to help you with decisions you have to make that are kind of outside the norm day to day, and you're not going to take to the employees in the organization, right? And I mean, Eric, you guys lived through this at Undertone. There was decisions you guys had to make on products, and are we going to invest here, invest there? You guys were small enough where you did it internally. Some people, you want board members to rely on that. It doesn't have to be a board of directors, by the way. You could do a board of advisors early on that could help accomplish the same thing. Remember, board of directors' role, the fiduciary responsibility for the company, their number one role is hiring and firing a CEO. That is the number one most important thing a board does, especially the bigger a company gets. But then consulting, contributing, and all those good things on strategy, direction, and so on. So do you need a board right away? No. When do you get a board? Typically when you get your first big investor. And more importantly, if you want to have those people around the table close to the company, you can create a board of advisors or a board of directors, put them there, and you begin to use them to, give insights and consult on company direction.
Okay, so you're raising money. You're going to assemble a board. Who should be on the board?
So whoever writes the biggest check's always going to want a seat, and usually you're going to give it to them. Let's just full stop. That's going to happen. This is where it gets a little messier. You typically don't want it to be two people from the investor and you as the founder, right? That's a pretty common thing that occurs. You always want to have an independent seat on the board. And an independent seat means this is somebody who has experience and knowledge that is helpful to the organization, but is not aligned with an investor class. So they're not voting, and look, this is the hard part on voting on boards. People are supposed to vote in favor of the company and what the company needs, not necessarily in the best interest of their investment, which are sometimes different things. But the reality is it always gets blurred, right? So you want to make sure that you have this independent seat, which is somebody who, they got some vested interest. You probably give them some options or some equity in the company, but they're not representing a big investor class. They're literally there just to represent what's smart, good input. And I often play the independent board member role. They're often to be the confidant of the CEO. They're there to give them advice and, not worry about the exit at the same level as they are helping them run the company.
What's the profile of the ideal independent director?
Yeah. Number one is they have something to offer the CEO. They have some experience. When I'm independent director, it's not always in businesses that I'm incredibly familiar with initially. I was an independent director in a company in education tech, right? I had nothing, but I could help coach the CEO, and actually as a co-founder group, I could coach them on managing a company, building a company, where to go, right? So I had history in the executive seat that could help build that organization out. More times than not, though, you're looking for someone who's got some understanding of the industry, who's going to have some executive experience. And importantly, you get along with. You want somebody you could just call casually and go, all right, I can't talk to anybody about this, but. And just a quick example of that, yesterday, I had lunch with a CEO whose board I am on, and it was exactly that conversation. Look, I'm not taking this conversation to the investors, but here's what I'm thinking right now, and here's the impact of AI in our business. Let's bat this around. And I don't want to scare the employees internally on what is a big strategic conversation. I want to form my thoughts better before I bring it inside. That's what you want that independent board member. Who do you want to have that conversation with?
So, okay, let's say, you see you're an adtech founder, you're raising a seed round. Okay, you're going to assemble a board. So you're going to end up having, what a typical board would be, you're going to have one person from Aperiam. You're going to have one independent board member, board director, and then the CEO.
That's really common. 3 to 5, right? You want 3 or 5. That's kind of where you're at. The odd numbers for obvious reasons, right? But you want 3 to 5 board members. What I will see is sometimes there's co-founders and they want both co-founders on the board. Great. Then the investors will say, then we get 2 seats and we get an independent seat, right? That's typically how you would see that play out. What's not uncommon as well is as you raise later rounds that the new investors want to come in and older investors step off the board. So I've seen it both ways, right? So, hey, I was an investor in the Series A. We're at Series C right now. I've stepped back, or I've moved into a board observer seat. Let me just delineate between board member and board observer. Board observer is somebody who has the right to be in the boardroom. They have the right to information the board has, and they may even contribute to the conversation, but they have no voting rights as part of the board. In some ways, board observer seats are cheap to give away. Not to everybody, but if you got an investor that's like, oh, I really want in, I want to be on the board. You're like, I don't want to add them to the board, but I can give you a board observer seat. That probably suffices in most cases. You don't want too many of them in there. I was on a board where we had 4 board observers. It was a lot. What's also very common is that an investor will say, I want a board seat and an observer seat. And the reason for that is they are going to come, but they're going to bring an associate in their firm as well. And that associate in the firm, once again, won't vote, but they're going to help them gather data. They're going to help them bring information back to the firm. They're going to be the ones that are going to dig through the board decks and, dissect the numbers and all that good stuff. So not an uncommon ask. And once again, it doesn't impact much.
So you said the chief role perhaps of the board is hiring and firing the CEO. So if I'm a tech founder and I hear that, I'm like, oh, I better get this right or my ass could get fired by, a hostile board. So how are boards structured and how should founders think about that?
Yeah, I mean, number one, every board hates firing the CEO. Absolutely, positively hates firing a CEO. I have been in situations where we had a CEO who should have been let go. And the board's like, let's try this. Let's try coaching. Let's get a good COO to put beneath them. Like they go to great lengths. So I say that that's their primary job, but let's remember, they don't want to do it. There's zero desire. Most board members want to see it succeed. So that's, step one. Step two, your board votes, but you also need shareholder approval, right? So for certain things, for hiring and firing the CEO, the board votes. It's a board vote, plain and simple. And so that's why if you're a founder, you want to put people on the board you really trust, you really, have a good relationship with. That's why picking your investor is so important. It's not just because of the money and what they do. It's also the fact that they're going to be on your board and you're going to be living with them and making strategic decisions for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to raise the point, and this is where there's a back and forth on this topic of boards having the ability and the power to fire CEOs. If you, as the representative of an investment firm on a board, are that person or part of that group that fires a CEO, it's quite serious for you reputationally. If it happens for cause. If it's for fraud, bad behavior, so on and so forth, everybody gets this, and you're acting properly on behalf of the investors, employees, everybody with a connection to the company. If it is a controversial thing, if it's something that could be argued wasn't deserved or it wasn't a very clear decision, you could be really affecting your ability to partner with founders and CEOs in the future. That's why it's, not as simple as just like, oh yeah, board can fire the CEO. Like that's part of their job. This could be like, a massive reputational implication for everybody involved.
It's a huge point, Eric. I was at I do work with a venture firm who I won't name, and you'll see why in a moment. And I was at their user conference or their executive conference, and they had a couple of CEOs there that were for potential future investors. And these future investments were doing due diligence on the firm. And they were asking questions like, have you run a company in the portfolio? Which CEOs do you know that they have fired? How often do they let CEOs go, right? They, what kind of people do they bring onto the board? And so the good news for this firm is that they were allowing these CEOs into the room with other executives and EIRs in their fund to do this diligence. Great job by those CEOs doing it. One of the women came to me and said openly, like a CEO of a company, she's like, they fire about half the CEOs of companies they invest in. Like, I don't think I'm going to do the deal. And she literally didn't do the
CEOs.
Her assessment. And there's not, I don't have the data, but that was her statement to me based on her due diligence in the room. And she chose not to take their investment. Right. So it's a huge point that to do that, you do your diligence on the fund and their activities in advance.
So that's a very good sort of reframe that, obviously it can happen, but the board is very much incentivized not to fire the founder, right? They're gonna do everything they can to make it work. That said, for the founder, is there anything in the technicalities of how the board is structured that sort of makes it more founder friendly? Like they often talk about this people talk about this in the context of Meta, right? That it's a very friendly board.
It's a very founder friendly. Well, Meta is founder friendly in a couple of ways, right? He structured the actual voting shares where he has complete control over it, and a board has really only symbolic responsibility, right? They accept the audits and they do board meetings because they're a public company and they have to, have board approval on things. But at the end of the day, the board has no ability to fire, executive there, right? That is the way the company was structured. Here's the reality. Most companies can't get away with that. Investors will see, super voting shares. We spoke with a company recently that is looking for investment, and they said, "Oh, by the way, we're structured as a super, voting. We have founder, I have 10-1 voting rights. It's a huge red flag. You're like, wait, we have no ability. Not that we want to make a change, but I want to feel like I have the ability to if I needed to, right? And this says you have no ability to whatsoever. So that will scare away a lot of investors. So can you put a structural thing in place to make sure that there's no chance anybody can take you out? Absolutely. By the way, the number one way to make sure nobody takes you out, don't raise any money. The less money you raise, the more control you have, period. Right? Full stop. But if you're taking money, you can structure it, super voting shares, all this other stuff, but that's going to restrict who will be willing to invest in your organization.
Well, it's actually a really interesting point because to get away with that kind of board structure as a founder, you probably need to have a pretty amazing company, right? A generational type company. Also nowadays with AI and how much easier it is to build, how much less capital intensive it is, like that type of company, to your point, they might just not raise at all if they're that successful at an early stage.
It's funny. I mean, I obviously with Aperiam involved in investing, I do personal investing for over a decade. And my first advice to founders is don't raise money until you have to. Don't start out planning to raise money. Start out and try to not raise money, right? That's step one. Then when you need to raise money, and it builds a healthier company. And I get criticized for those that don't know, I'm from Chicago, and people will be like, oh, that's Midwest thinking, too conservative. It's like, yeah, but if you watch the East and West Coast thinking, it's go like crazy, burn a lot of cash, but that's because they're willing to burn a lot of companies because that one success will overtake. If you want to build a strong, sustainable company, going fast succeeds for only a few. Does not succeed for most.
Yeah. The math works out for the investors if they're betting that, they're going to have 100 or 1000x return and they're going to have a lot of failures, but maybe not for the founder of each individual company.
This is why it's fun having Corey in the room. Hey, you don't need to take on any investment, he says with an open checkbook as an investor. He's our greatest salesperson.
It's exactly. Like, just get the, make sure you're right sizing your company and right sizing the checks. Like that's the other, it's one of my favorite parts of the show Silicon Valley. The founder of the company goes to the bar, talk to another investor, and he's like, they're offering me this much. Maybe I should only take like 2 million. And he goes, wait, I could have taken less. Could have taken less. What do you do? The guy freaks out because I was like, I could have taken less. And so, Derek's point, what I love about Aperiam is, look, we're not writing the $10 and $20 million checks, right? We're not out there, overdoing it. We're getting into early stage. We're writing what I think is really a right-sized check. So we don't have to find a way to put money to work. One thing to keep in mind as a founder is a lot of these investors have to write a certain amount of checks a year at a certain dollar amount. So they might say, oh, you need 10 million. Why? Because they need to write a $10 million check and they want more of your organization. And I'm not saying it's all nefarious. It may not hurt to have the money, but maybe you don't always need that right at that point in time. You don't need to give up that much equity. So that's the number one best way to stay in control as a founder. The less money you raise, the more control you have, and not just more ownership, more control you have, and the less powerful the voices are around the table. Give you a simple example. I mean, I have run into this multiple times, and I'm, again, not going to name companies, where a company has exited because that was what the investors needed at that point in time for the life in their funds. Right. And you're the founder. You're like, hey, I don't want to exit yet. And you're like, yeah, that's great. I got to get out.
That's actually a great point and not well understood. That and the point you made prior in terms of, funds needing to put a certain check to work. For a lot of venture and for all of private equity, they just run on models. So we need particularly with venture, but also for private equity, we need a certain percentage ownership to make our entire fund model work. When it comes to, private equity in particular, because they control the companies and they have a 5 to 7 year timeline. All right, we are on year 7. You're selling the company. And we can tell you to sell the company because we control. So this is where all this stuff comes together, and it's very interesting, and it's like an under-discussed thing. So it's like super helpful to have you on because it forces us to, I think, give overviews of stuff that we might not necessarily do so.
Yeah, I mean, a term I use all the time is fund dynamics, right? What are the fund dynamics between your different shareholders? Give you an example. You've got a company where you've done 3 rounds of fundraising. You did an angel round, so you got a bunch of smaller checks in there. You did a Series A and a Series B. Well, maybe the Series B gave a little bit of liquidity to the founders, gave a little bit of liquidity to the Series A, so they got a little bit back. Your clock restarted on Series B, meaning you got that 5 to 7 years until they have to exit. And by the way, as an investor in funds, I call a fund. If I'm like on year 6 or 7 and I haven't gotten distributions, I'll call the people and go, what's going on? Where's my money? What's going on? Right. So they have real pressure from the investors. But now they got 5 to 7 years. Series A, they got a little liquidity, depending on how much they got. Maybe they're on a longer time scale now, so they don't care. And they're maybe willing to take a little more of a gamble because they already got some cash out. So they're willing to go a little longer. Angel investors are probably like, hey, wow, I've been here even longer. I've already been here 5 years, and you just brought somebody in who's got a 5 to 7 year timeline. I'm going to wait another 5. Wait, what's going on here? Right. And so these dynamics really impact the boardroom.
So once you have a board, we just talked a lot about how to structure and when to raise, whether to raise, et cetera. Once you have a board as a founder, how do you engage with them effectively?
It is important to figure out what you want from them. Some of your investors are going to come in and they're going to give you a model. I was on a board where a company called Packback. I was on that board for 10 years. I was the second check into the company and happily stayed with them all the way till their exit. And University Ventures came in and said, here's how we do it. We do weekly calls, and it's not a board call. I'm doing a one-on-one with you, the founder and one of the other key and the CFO at the time every week. And they were like, oh, for how long? Nope. This is what we do now, right? And then we're doing we don't do quarterly meetings, we do bi-monthly meetings, and they gave them a model. I was the independent director on that board, and I was like, I'll happily attend the board meetings. I don't need regular calls with you, right? So the reason I give that example is each board member is different, which also speaks to having a smaller board. Right. But each board member is different, and your lead investor. So, yes, do you need a chairman? Don't you need a chairman? Look, in a smaller company, you don't really need a chairman. A big public company, you do. In a smaller company, you don't. But there's going to be a kind of guide for the board, and that's your lead investor. Who's got the biggest, most recent check into the company? That person is going to have more influence over the board than anything else. What is my cadence with my lead investor? What is my cadence of interaction with them? My rule for a board is bad news travels fast. If I'm looking like I'm off for my numbers, I'm going to personally call every one of the board members and say, hey, I want to let you know we're having a problem. All right. Here's what we see. And, so I want to establish that you're going to hear from me if something's going wrong. I'm not just calling to brag. As a matter of fact, I'm probably not going to call to brag. I'll do that in board meetings. I'm going to call you when there's problems, or I'm going to call you when we have a big strategic thing like, hey, we might want to buy this, or somebody approached us about this. Right. So figure out those ad hoc, figure out your regular interaction with your lead board member, so to speak. And then hopefully you have an independent and you want to just build a personal relationship with them. Questions I get as independent. Hey, do I have the right CFO? Man, I'm having a real problem with my head of sales. I don't want to tell the board. I don't want to freak them out, but here's what I'm seeing. What would you do if you were me? Right. Or I'm getting different pressure from the 2 investors on the board. How do you balance it? You want to build that relationship so you can have those kind of conversations with your independent off board meeting.
What are your tips and best practices, Corey, for founders to manage boards, and particularly around board meetings? There's 4-year. Typically, you need to provide information. You need to set an agenda. You have desired outcomes. What do you like to see there, or what's been most effective?
Number one, first and foremost, give them the damn numbers. It drives me crazy when especially in an early stage company, you go in and they're like, oh, and we think this is good. And we say no, just what are your financials? Show me the numbers, right? Show me what's going on in the business. So your deck should be numbers forward at the beginning of the deck, but that shouldn't be most of the meeting. You shouldn't spend the whole meeting on numbers. It should be quick. As a matter of fact, you can send it in advance. They can review it and ask questions. You don't have to present the numbers in depth. The board meeting, especially early on as a founder, should be about strategic direction, investments, and moves we're making. If you're growing through the cycle, hey, we're about to add this role to the organization. We're about to add that role to the organization. Why do you start with numbers first? Because you're going to justify all these other moves. Why do I need a head of sales? Why do I need to add 2 new salespeople? But it's all in budget. We're good, right? Because anything you ask me about strategically in a business, my first question is going to be, can we afford it? Can we pay for it, right? So give me that damn data up front and let's have an easy conversation on it. So I like to structure my board meetings and a gentleman named Fran Moroso is a huge mentor to me. He was our CEO at Rovi. He'd been CEO of multiple public companies, and he'd been on numerous boards. He was chairman at Yahoo for a while. And he's like, every good board meeting starts with financials, period. And he's right. He's totally right. So it starts with financials. Where are we at? And importantly, as an early stage company, those financials include cash out date. Like, how much cash do we have? Because we all on the board need to be thinking about if we either need to raise money or we need to do something differently to get to that cash, right? So that's the beginning of my meeting. Then, depending on what stage I'm at, I will either have some of my other execs come in and talk. It's good for the board to hear from others in the company. A head of sales on what's going on in the market, or maybe a head of product or engineering on what's new in the technology. I always liked to have other execs speak as well. Like I had my head of HR speak multiple times a year. In part, it helped that person get exposure, but it also gives the board a different view. And by the way, most boards complain about it. Like, oh, why do I have to hear the head of HR? It's like, well, first off, it's good for that person to get their experience, and I want to build executives. But second off, if you were listening, you're going to learn new things about the company you're not going to hear from me. Now, this is on you. I'm giving you the opportunity to learn, right? So number one, get those financials. Number two, get through some reports from the executive team. And then number three, big strategic questions. Like that's a really simple form outline, and you could use it every meeting.
Selfishly, and because we talk a lot about marketing on this pod, I'm curious. So like, let's say the CMO or the VP of marketing talks to the board once a year. What do you want to hear from them?
You typically have them twice a year, right? And my problems is head of marketing usually was coming in with flashy slides showing the trade show booth. Like that's just not a useful head of marketing, right? It's like come in and explain and the relationship that I want between my head of product and my head of engineering. This is a whole nother story because I like to separate those roles. I don't make them one. Different topic. Those two need to be symbiotic. The head of sales and marketing need to be symbiotic, right? So I'm walking in. What I want to hear from my head of marketing is how am I supporting the sales team? How am I driving numbers? And if we have goals outside of numbers, brand awareness, all the other stuff, why do we have them? How are we accomplishing it? Why is it useful? But ultimately, you're there because you co-own that number with the sales leader. And so show me how you're helping that happen. That's the most impactful marketing conversation.
Personally, as a marketer, I'm glad to hear that. Because I think that what marketers often struggle with is ultimately really what matters with marketing is like, are we contributing to revenue? Right? Like, are we like generating more pipeline? Are we generating, like, as we look at the whole funnel, are we generating awareness and differentiating the company? And that leads to more sales calls, which leads to more revenue. Where it gets complicated is obviously a lot of marketers, they don't want to be held to revenue in a vacuum because they're not actually the ones closing the deals. But then I think that leads to like a very unrealistic sort of siloing where the marketer gets held to some bullshit metric, like let's say MQLs or whatever. And then that incentivizes them to like, again, just bullshit things. Cause then they're looking for a way to just say to the board or the CEO, yep, we drove all these MQLs. And like, they again, a lot of the time it's really bullshit, but it's like, knowing what I do about marketing, if I were on a board, I think what I would want to hear from the marketer is like, do we have an overall like philosophy and strategy that makes sense? That's like creating the category or differentiating us within the category. And can we see that that's generating attention that is then leading to pipeline that is leading to sales? And will the sales leader co-sign that?
That last part is the critical point, right? I'm on one board. They do an excellent job, D-Scout, where the head of marketing comes in and shows the marketing funnel, right? Like here's who we get them and and then sales picks up at that point and says, and then here's what we see at this stage, right? We share this funnel. It's not the marketing funnel in the sales pipeline. We share a funnel. Yeah. And that's what I say, the symbiotic relationship. That's what you want to see from marketing. Let me give you one other area where marketing could be coming to the board. It's not directly revenue because marketing can impact value of the company. And this happened when I was at Rovi. So for those that don't know Rovi, the really quick story is we were a company called Macrovision. We did a bunch of acquisitions. Two of the biggest ones we bought Gemstar TV Guide out of News Corp. And so now suddenly we're this old Macrovision company, which was 25 years old. And we actually did copy protection for VHS tapes, believe it or not. One of the most profitable businesses I've ever seen in my life. But we've just bought TV Guide out of News Corp. But TV Guide came with all this TV and guide data. It came with patents. It came with the guide. We sold off the network and all this other stuff. So all of a sudden, and we had done 2 other acquisitions in 3 weeks. So we announced Gemstar TV Guide and 2 other acquisitions at the same time. Why do I go through that? Well, one of my responsibilities was marketing, and I said, we got to rename the company, right? And everyone's like, how's it going to drive revenue? And the CFO, James Budge, love James, but he just kept saying to me like, dude, I don't get it. And then finally he was like, fine, you can only spend this amount of money to change the name. And I was like, I'm good, but great. But we're not just going to change the name. We're going to use the name change as an opportunity to not just rebrand the company, but launch the new product that explains why we put all these acquisitions together and launch our data business and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden people are like, so we go to the board and the board's like, how is it going to drive more revenue? Well, if we package it all up and we do this, by the way, I'm shortcutting months of conversation. Ultimately, we changed the name to Rovi, but we didn't just change the name. We launched it on the NASDAQ Market Exchange. We did a buyout of Times Square for the day. So the entire thing was Rovi's name. We did an investor day at the NASDAQ Marketplace in Times Square where we launched the new product. Yeah, the new name was there, but it was about the new product and how the new product was going to drive revenue and why the new name represented it. And our stock went up 15% that day. And it continued to go up after that, right? And the CFO, and James, to his credit, he's like, all right, well done. And by the way, you came in under budget, so marketing isn't always purely just leads, MQLs, SQLs, and so on. It can have that level of strategic impact, but it takes real work and you're selling, you're marketing to the organization why it has that kind of impact.
There was a point last year after the Vine AI launch and with Tim and Chris being so much more present in the market where, the value of Vine stock had like 2.5x, right? And it's like, I know that they've told me personally that they think, marketing had a huge role in that. Obviously
Yes.
They were also like launching a product that was driving a ton of pipeline and whatever, but the pipeline was indissociable from the marketing strategy. And so again, when it's working, that is how it should work. And it's not, I guarantee you, Tim and Chris were never like, what is marketing's exact contribution to the, what is how many marketing qualified leads did we generate, whatever? They were like, we have moved into the center of the industry conversation and we're generating a shit ton more sales pipeline and the value of the company is increasing. And all of that is part of one cohesive story of how marketing and sales work together.
And to further support your point, I go back to the company I mentioned, D-Scout. They do a great job of showing how this shared funnel, but marketing also talks about something called Collab that they run, which is bringing designers and researchers together and how they become the center of the industry and all that other good stuff, right? So it's the hard numbers, but also the soft value of marketing that you've got to balance. And as a board member, I need to accept that. The problem you get with a lot of board members, especially investors, is they just want the hard value stuff. Right? Like, why would I do a user conference? What does that matter for me? And so on. It's like your job as a CEO is to help explain that soft value as well of marketing when they're presenting there. And make sure you have a board that isn't just, it's all about leads and a bunch of SDRs and all this other good stuff. It is there. That's important. But that soft value can add real value to the organization. And you need to coach your board through why that's helpful. And it's why it's important. I think a head of marketing has got to be up at least twice a year in front of the board.
And I think what we're going off on a bit of a tangent around marketing here, but it's very germane.
I tried to pull it back to the board. I tried.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, I made this happen, so thank you for indulging me. But I think marketing often has a toxic relationship with the board and the CFO. Where it's like exactly what you were saying, Corey, about the CFO being like, how is this going to drive value, or like boards being like, where are the leads or whatever. What I see is, I would say 80% of marketers just wilt. Like when they face those questions, they absolutely freaking fold and they're just like, okay. And then they're like, we need to find someone who can do HubSpot to show I'm like driving the leads, even if the business doesn't really work like that, right? Like even if it's the kind of business where it's like you're doing really like a very low number of high value enterprise deals where it's like, look, this just isn't a math equation in the same way as like, a very simple SaaS tool where it's like we're sending out a fucking, barrage of SDRs to drum up leads.
Well, Undertone was a great example of that, right? One of the massive transformations we went through in my time at Undertone is, I walked in the door, Undertone was 95% desktop display ads. When I left, we were 4%, 95 to 4 in a couple of year period. And we completely flipped over into high impact. How does this relate to the board? Well, the board was like, well, what's our marketing? How many leads are we driving? I'm like, no, this is all about agency relationships. And we got an amazing sales team, which is now shown by how many of them hold senior executive roles at other companies, right? We had an amazing sales team. And it was like, take advantage of their relationships. This is about driving this agency by agency, brand by brand. I don't need to go out and run a bunch of campaigns and get people to click through and have them attend a webinar and get into. We know who they are. We need time in front of them. We need to create opportunities to get to the people we already have relationships with. And the good news is, our board, and I'll credit, Mike Cassidy stayed on the board. He was a terrific board member. Come back to if a founder leaves and joins a board, but Mike was a terrific board member. Mike supported me, even though he was like, he's like, okay, good. And JMI Equity, who was the lead investor, was like, cool. All right, let's see how it works. And it worked. That's where you got to bring your board along and have them understand this. When you talk about communication with the board, I wouldn't just leave those for board meetings. I would look at these big open topics and I would be like, okay, I know where so-and-so stands. I'm going to need a couple of calls with them in advance of the meeting. I'm going to have to get them on board. Let me bring so-and-so to that call. And I would have strategies. The thing you have to remember is as soon as you have a board, you have to manage your board, right? When I say have a board as late as possible, it's because the board can't be an afterthought and only thinking about the meetings and the agenda. You have to bring them along and you have to, help them understand what's going on. I forget half of what happened at the last board meeting if and I take notes and I'm an active board member and I forget half of it. Why? Because I'm only seeing you once a quarter. Right. And so it's your job as the executive to bring me along and not assume that I remember everything. Right?
Part of what this illustrates is that internal comms is as important as external comms, right?
100%.
External comms, how you tell the story, galvanize customers and those who influence them, generate pipeline, whatever. But the story you tell internally about what you're doing and why is how you get everyone on board with that so that leadership understands it, sales understands it, product, marketing, etc. And so the ability to tell that story as a marketer of like, here's what we're doing and why and how we're going to grow attention and shift the perception of the company and drive pipeline and then making sure sales co-signs that is as important as any of the things that you're actually doing. And if you can't do that, and again, you just wilt and you say, all right, well, my board wants to see the MQLs and whatever, so I'm just going to show them this equation that I know is bullshit, the whole company is going to suffer as a result of your inability to put that story together.
I couldn't agree more. Look, I think as a CEO, your job on the internal communication, I'm a radical transparency guy. I want to tell everybody exactly what's going on in the organization, even if it's not great news. Why? They trust you more. They come along with you. When you do have rough times, they help with the transition, right? But I do the same with the board. I want the board to know, to that point, the more that the organization understands the strategy, the more they know how to make their own good decisions. I see this in companies all the time where the CEO is like, oh man, everything's on my back. Everybody comes to me. It's like, and it's not that you haven't, quote, empowered them. You haven't given them the information. You're holding things back. You've got to be as open as possible. And I believe when it comes to a board, more CEOs hide information from their board or try not to tell them everything. When I took over at one company, not Undertone, when I took over a company, I found out that there were 2 days of rehearsals for board meetings. And so when I had my first board meeting, I was like, okay, great. I got your decks. Let's go. And someone's like, well, what about rehearsal? I'm like, we're not rehearsing. This isn't about me tuning what you say so it's sanitized to the board. Now, I'm not going to contradict my executives in a board meeting, right? So I'm not going to bring a board. It drove me crazy on one board where the management team would begin to ask people questions and challenge things in the board meetings. Like, hey, guys, you do that offline. Let the board do that here. But don't make this a polished, rehearsed studio production unless you're trying to just piss the board off and push them away, right?
Again, you want to tell a cohesive story. You don't want to rehearse it to the point where you're trying to like anticipate all of these objections and kind of like fool the board. Like you want to be clear and cohesive. You're not trying to like get one over on the board.
Exactly. Look, my process for a board meeting is, let's say my board meeting was August 1st. So we're at the end of June here. August 1st. By the beginning of next week, I'd have an agenda out to my board meeting. So beginning of July, I'd have an agenda out to my board meeting. It would identify who is responsible for presenting this meeting, who is responsible for what, and what are the key strategic thematic topics we're going to talk about. I'd hold executive team meetings weekly. On that meeting, we'd talk through the agenda and I'd say, like, here are the key hot points from last board meeting. Here's the things I want you to cover. Here's the things I want you to cover. We touch on all that. And then I'd give them a due date about 10 days in advance of the board meeting, with the expectation of sending a deck to the board 2 to 3 days in advance. And I would have, a week or so to review and do exactly what you're talking about there, Joe, is the aligning. I despise when a CEO outsources this shit to a COO or somebody else. A CFO can run the process. I'm happy with that. But you, as the CEO, you own the message, you own the strategy, you own the vision, and you own how it's communicated to the board. Do not outsource that shit. You own it, right? And so that means you're going through the board deck and you're walking through it. I see a lot of laziness in CEOs like, oh, I got to the seat, so like, I don't have to now. No, it's exactly what you have to do. That's the job.
Eric is laughing. Is this conjuring any memories for you, Eric? Or
No, not at all. I'm just like looking at the agenda of all the topics that we wanted to cover, and through the past however many minutes of just like providing examples and anecdotes and frameworks, like we've covered all of them. Yeah, Corey's a machine.
Yeah, Corey is he's good at this. He's done this before. Corey, maybe we can end on this note with just stories. I mean, you've been providing anecdotes, you've been going along to illustrate your points, but are there any, like either as a CEO or as a board member, are there any outstanding situations that occur to you of moments where it's like, wow, the board like really made a very positive difference to the company and the CEO, or vice versa, where you were like, you're a board member and you're like, yo, leave the board out of this. They're not helping.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to that company, Packback. I was on the board of for that long time. University Ventures came in, and this was Packback wisely picked University Ventures as an investor because they were in education tech, and University Ventures was an education tech investor. And Troy from University Ventures walked in and it was like, you guys need to be part of this group in the industry. I'm going to introduce you to this person who's going to help over here. And he made a bunch of really impactful connections over the years, and that continued on through the exit, right? And so that was the company knowing they were young. I actually invested in them as they were still in college. So they were really young when they got going. But they took advantage of his network, his expertise, and he drove it. That's where, and that's one area a board member can be really helpful. I've got a lot of examples. A really common thing is a CEO says, I got it. We got somebody in finance, and a board member comes in and says, let me help you bring in a real CFO. Let's get a real CFO. Let's see what it is. And I've seen this probably half a dozen times now. And then you get the right CFO that board member already knew and they could trust. Transformation. All of a sudden, the CEO's like, oh my God, wow, my world is so different. I'm not worrying about accounts payable. It's all taken care, and all that good stuff. So they can help identify weaknesses in executive teams and fill it. I've seen many examples. They can help you with strategic introductions. And every once in a while, you'll sit in a board meeting and some board member will go, hey, and this happened at Yellow, do we have a big enough total available market? You go, let me go work on that. That's a good question. And that's a board at its best, right? Where they're asking you that good question that forces you to go, we got to go work on that, right? So that's great. My most frustrating thing about boards in this space, in the ad tech, MarTech space, is the number of times boards and investors try and force a company into a SaaS model. Is there any way we could do this as SaaS? Like, it's just like the market doesn't buy that way. They just don't buy that way. And that's where you as a CEO have to own it. Like, hey, this is our model. This is what we are. And you got to make sure your investors understand that. So that's a real problem, is when the board actually wants to change the billing and structural model. Problem number two is when an investor invests with a thesis that requires transformation. And what do I mean by that? Investors all have a thesis when they invest. They believe X, Y, and Z is going to happen. That's why they're going to triple their money. Well, if that X, Y, and Z is you're competing in a different market, or you're adding another product, or you're doing something else. I've had this once where an investor invested on the idea that we are going to add a completely different product because we could sell that same product into the same customer base, but we had to go build it. We had to go build it from scratch, and it didn't work, and it caused a big problem, right? So I always get really nervous when they come in and say, well, the thesis is if we adjust the company and we twist it, you're like, we're kind of playing a business school game there. That doesn't play out, right? So I get really leery about that when I get asked to join a board and I hear that. I'm like, I don't think I want to be here.
It goes back to your point earlier about, how sometimes board members will spin off because it's a little bit of like the right board member for the right time in the company's evolution, and also balancing being a great generalist and having a lot of board experience, a lot of corporate experience versus having domain expertise. And at different times, you need like a different profile of a person to help the company along. So it's fascinating and a dynamic that is not discussed enough. So it's awesome to have you here talking about it.
And one last item before we wrap is don't forget.
Corey's got the list.
This is a really important one. Boards also control executive compensation.
Yes.
CEOs should not get raises unless boards approve that. A good CEO doesn't give their executive team raises without at least running it by the board, right? So remember, at the end of the day, your compensation, that is one thing governed by the board, and your bonus and all that good stuff. So on one hand, that says that's why you may not want a board for a while. But on the other hand, it's once you have a board, know that it's running through them as well.
Well, I'm already thinking about the long list of people to whom I want to send this episode. I think a lot of CEOs will find it valuable, but I think also our little detour into marketing, super valuable, Corey, because I think a lot of marketing leaders they have no preparation for that. And then one day they have to show up in front of a board, and maybe they ask the CEO, they're like, hey, what should I know? But the CEO also usually isn't a marketer. So they don't know what it looks like from that person's perspective. So I've basically never heard anyone articulate that advice, because I think it's just like a very under discussed topic in the marketing world. And as I said, I think the most common advice, which is bad advice, is basically you just need to come up with some like often bullshit numbers. They like numbers. So it's like, just come up with, find a dashboard that tells a good story and run with that. So I think to hear it from someone who's been a CEO and a board member many times, that there is another way, that of course you want numbers that illustrate the story, but you also need to have your philosophy as a marketing leader about what you're doing and how it coheres with what sales is doing. I think that's a super valuable and under discussed perspective.
And how you're establishing and owning your brand in the market, because that's important.
Exactly.
Depending on the composition of the board and the timeline, you should assume as a marketing leader, you're walking into a room with people that view marketing as a cost. And your goal as a marketer in that meeting and every further meeting is to show them how marketing is growth. Simple as that.
Exactly.
I also think it's like telling a story about how you approach marketing, right? Like I'm working with Emily Robinson at TV Scientific, relevant because TV Sci is an Aperiam portfolio company, and the VP of marketing over there, and they're absolutely crushing it at marketing. Sharp Pen client, they have a concept called brand gravity, and it's essentially a version of the Sharp Pen playbook, right? It's like bringing people to the brand, driving inbound by leveraging Jason as chief evangelist. It's like I've been working with Emily on telling that story, right? Because it's like there's a story of what the company is doing and like what TV Sci is saying to the market, but there's also the story of how marketing is approaching that reputation building project, and then of course how it coheres with sales. So I think you need to have your multiple stories as a marketing leader. You need to have the story of the company itself and how you're differentiating in the space and galvanizing your customers, but then also the story of how you are approaching building that reputation and what the strategy is. And that's going to be much more compelling, especially if sales cosigns, than just like a list of numbers.
And don't be afraid of having someone called chief evangelist. I've had people working for me with the title chief evangelist.
I always say it's my dream job. If I were in a Sharp Pen one day, I'm going to be a professional attack dog.
I guess we got to let Eric land this thing and we can go on.
Yes. And shout out to Emily, who I did not know. I was unfamiliar with her game. When she came on the stage at Possible and did the presentation, we did like a live pitch presentation of a couple of companies pitching Acorns, the brand. Emily crushed it in a way that I was unprepared for. So she is a weapon that can be wielded. The head of marketing for TV Sci, exactly. Like, rocked the room like she was the head of sales. So shout out to Emily. We should have her on one day, actually.
They got a rock star team over there. So thank you. Thank you very much, Corey. Thank you, Eric, for indulging me at great length in this episode. And this is one I'm going to send to a lot of our clients and friends.
Corey, you're the best.
Thanks,
we got to be back. All right. Take care, everybody.
See you soon.
Next week.